Welcome to the ProSocial Workers Podcast, the place where social work meets diversity, dialogue, and ethical practice. Here we offer courses that promote viewpoint and political diversity while fostering human connection. And the best part? Our content is completely free to access. For professional social workers and interested others, we provide the option to earn continuing education credits with a simple fee after listening to our episodes. Go to prosocialworkers.com to learn more. Together, we'll explore how to truly put the social back into social work. So, tune in, get inspired, and join us on this journey towards a more inclusive and connected future.
Hello and welcome to the ProSocial Workers Podcast. Today I am pleased to join Dr. David Darazotis, commonly known as Dr. Dave to his colleagues, friends, and students. Dr. Dave has decades of experience working in social work and as a social work educator, most recently at the University of Utah, where he's currently emeritus. He teaches part-time there and does other social work kinds of things, clinical practice, as well as participating in different events such as this one today. And one of his areas of expertise is in dialogue. And dialogue is a core feature of our pro-social workers movement. Specifically, we seek to humanize. And so thank you for joining us, Dr. Dave. We're excited to have this discussion and hope that it's meaningful to you as well as to those that we serve.
Thanks, Matt.
So tell us a little bit, just first of all, about your experience and background. Tell us your origin story. How did you get interested in dialogue? And just tell us a little bit about what your experience has been with it.
In a way, Matt, I think I kind of was born to be a facilitator. I remember being in third grade, excuse me, and we're supposed to report on this. We're supposed to make a report, and I decided for my report I'd bring a couple of my friends and have them talk to each other. And I remember the teacher saying, "This is very unusual. We usually don't see people doing this." And to me, it was like something that was fun, and I enjoyed it. And I must have had an inclination or interest in getting people together and talking about things that seemed meaningful to me. I was fortunate that I ran into Maurice Friedman, who wrote a book about dialogue and who was a biographer of Martin Buber. And Buber, of course, was a Jewish theologian whose family members, many of them were killed by Nazis during World War II. And following the war, Matt, he decided that the best thing he could do was to have a dialogue with Nazis about, we're talking about bridging differences that divide us, an enormous difference. Imagine having a dialogue with people that murdered your family. So he did it. And Friedman was fascinated by that. That was back when I was in California. And when 9/11 happened, I was in Utah teaching at the College of Social Work at the U and had the good fortune of running into some people that I met who were psychologists who wanted to do something in response to 9/11. And we all felt that dialogue was the most appropriate response to 9/11, to have conversations, especially with people that differ from us, that see things differently about what happened.
Yeah.
And why is there so much hatred, so it's kind of like Buber's question, why would someone want to kill all these people in that kind of way, where did that hatred come from? And, why are we in this predicament? So that led to a whole bunch of things. And, really getting involved in dialogue has informed everything I do in social work, as we'll probably talk about.
Yeah. So is this something that you learned about, or is this something that just kind of developed organically in your practice?
Kind of a combination, Matt. I started realizing that everything I do in social work was a form of dialogue. As a teacher, an academic teacher, right? I really like to teach through dialogue. And, we're going to do a few slides in a few moments, I guess. But, I feel the most alive when there's a dialogue in the classroom. And so I started creating that more and more in my classes the way I wanted to teach, and found that students liked it and it worked. I found that, you know, as with my therapist hat on, because I mainly taught practice classes, and I wanted to continue to do direct service myself, that I'm facilitating dialogue with people, essentially, and started to occur to me that most everything we do is dialogue practice, because I also do community mental health things, more meso macro things, and that's dialogue too, getting people together, as you know, to get anything done on a meso or macro level requires cooperation of some kind, and give and take. And
That's great. So some of this is in your DNA. It showed up as early as third grade, probably even before that. But then in your profession, as an educator, dialogue you found to be, and I really enjoy that too. That the classes that are less didactic and more about dialogue, that there's almost a parallel process there, isn't there? That you're
seems
teaching
like
about
it.
how you do it.
Seems like it. Yeah, probably no matter what I taught, I would try to have dialogue be a part of the teaching method.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, very good. So that's a good little bit of good perspective. Now, tell us let's get into this a little bit and tell us why. Why should, as social workers or as people, citizens in a community, even family members, why should we? Why is dialogue important or relevant?
Well, if we advance to the next slide, there's a question there. So I'm kind of in dialogue with you, Matt, which I enjoy. And so if I said, well, what's our biggest challenge today? To sort of address that question, not just on the individual level, but on all levels, so-called meso, so-called macro. What's the biggest challenge that humanity faces today in what we call 2025? And you already know the answer, so I
Sure.
can't, you can't pretend,
Or
and,
just
and
look
say,
at
well,
it.
is it this? Is it that?
Yeah, I mean, there's war, there's polarization, there's political polarization. I mean, people would answer, have multiple responses to that question, but yeah,
And if we go to the next slide, here's what it looks like to me. Shakespeare said it best. He said simply, to be or not to be in Hamlet, right? Yeah, that is the question. And of course, the intent in that play was a little bit different, but the basic idea is similar. Are we going to exist as humans? And then, you and I are social workers, so we can add, are we going to exist, and are we going to use our resources, for the well-being, not just of the people
yeah,
alive today, all people, including those with no voices, and who are minoritized, but also how about people 2, 5, 7 generations from now? Many, of course, not even born yet. Because what we do today will determine whether they exist.
well, that's great. That's great. So, to be or not to be in a pluralistic society, do we want pluralism or do we want homogeny? Do we all just want to be the same, or do we value diversity?
Yes, and not only that, but something even more simple and basic, which is, will there be human beings? I'll ask students that often in most of my classes or when I do presentations. Do you think people will be around on Earth 100 years from now, or 200 years from now, or 1,000 years from now? And I'd say roughly half the people say, yeah, maybe, and half say, maybe not, right? And then we'll start talking about that. Well, did you answer it that way? Start to think about what we could call global survival threats. Those things that could be the end of humanity. And of course, again, as social workers, we don't just necessarily hope that people are around, but that we hope for the well-being. So it's not just survival, but, a survival where people have, work that's meaningful, that have enough to eat, that have housing, that are, treated decent by other people, where
Yeah.
we don't use our brightest minds to continue to invent more devastating ways to murder each other,
Mm.
but to use our intelligence to, create well-being.
So there's natural disasters that could very easily wipe us out. There's no need to self-destroy. if you will, through broken social bonds.
Yeah. And we're all well aware, just turn on the news, right?
Yeah.
We're all well aware of those things that threaten our well-being, whether it's threats of war, nuclear war, the climate crisis and all the different parts of that, as well as we just went through a pandemic. We still have that illness, and that affected most everyone on the planet. And those kinds of crises remind us of the importance of connection and cooperation, which is really what we're talking about today, right?
Absolutely.
The recognition of the connection we have with each other and all other living things, and the planet that keeps us alive, as
Right.
well as, the importance of cooperation, because without cooperation, it doesn't seem very likely we will, you know, uh, deal with these survival threats intelligently.
Yeah. That so there's just kind of these natural things that occur, but how can we improve socially as well? How do we relate to one another? How do we dialogue? How do we give and receive influence, information, energy, if you will?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, of course, there's always been natural, we could call it natural threats to our existence, that our ancestors have had to deal with, like no food or the ice age, or,
Right.
so on and so forth. But wild animals that eat us, but the things that threaten us today are human caused, primarily human caused. And there's just a wealth of information about that. So starting with that idea that our existence today is threatened by our own activity, and that in order to step back from that, and change the way that we view each other and our ability to cooperate, we need to start to be in dialogue with each other, and then begin to change the way we view each other. And like you said, you mentioned polarization when we showed that first slide. What's the biggest challenge today? Obviously, it's not just in the US. You can see evidence of that all over the world, within and between countries. Polarization. And as social workers, we know that it's really easy to stereotype other groups, make the other wrong.
Yeah. The
We
other
know that
others. Yeah.
right? Yeah. And we know that in a few seconds, in a few seconds, we've already created stereotypes about each other when we meet for the first time. That's what we do. And it probably, years ago, thousands of years ago, that must have contributed to survival to some degree, to recognize strangers and to be prepared and all that. It doesn't help us today to stereotype, and so unlearning some things that were useful to us in the past to survive
Yeah.
is hard to do, but we have to do it if we're going to stick around.
So dialogue is kind of part of our evolution that
It
we've
seems like it.
as we've moved in many parts of the world, not everywhere, but we have to be mindful of those who are still struggling to survive, and just on a very physical, temporal level. But as we've evolved into more of a social context matters much more than it ever has in the history of our planet, as many have moved out of survival needs into being able to thrive a little bit. And
Well, that's right. Yeah. And we don't, I mean, there's some controversy about this among people that study these things, but there's a lot of evidence that, we were good at, or reasonably good
yeah,
enough at communication within the in-group,
yeah,
like my immediate family or my tribe, if you will, that I lived in. We lived in
yeah,
more tribal associations, right? And the out-group, the strangers, we call it xenophobia now, the fear of the other, that maybe that served us. Now, we're so interconnected. I mean, the air we're breathing here in Utah,
yeah,
maybe it was in Beijing a week ago,
right,
and whatever we pumped in the air here, they're breathing, right? Or the pandemic, the microorganisms that are making people sick in Africa or South America are the same ones making us sick. And, it's becoming more and more apparent to all of us,
we
the
really do
interconnection.
share. We really we share the environment, the climate, the world, the space that we live in, and somehow we've got to figure out how to be social in dialogue. So Dave,
Yes.
tell me a little bit. How do you define dialogue, or what does that look like?
My favorite definition, and of course, Buber's, a teacher, he called it confirmation of otherness. It's a really simple way to say it. I like it because I'm in dialogue. I not only confirm who you are, which is going to be in some ways different than me, but I also confirm who I am, and
Okay.
that's me. But if I said it in a little fancier way with more words, I would say dialogue. The purpose of dialogue is to form relationships across the differences that currently divide us. So it's a relationship building activity. So it doesn't necessarily result in an agreement. It tends to promote cooperation. So it tends to lead to that. But I think it's important for those that want to practice dialogue, and I think most of social work is dialogue, is to recognize it's a relationship building communication strategy. Yes.
Confirmation of otherness. So, let me just define a few things here. So, do you think confirmation? How does that relate to affirmation nowadays? Is affirmation kind of an evolution of what confirmation may have meant before?
Maybe, I don't know Buber. I can't ask him,
Sure.
but I might think of those terms interchangeably.
Okay. And
You
then
know,
otherness, is that otherizing or is that just acknowledging differences?
acknowledging differences, but especially those differences that seem to divide us.
Okay.
So dialogue is, and let's face it, everyone in some way is a stranger, but some more than others. So even let's take a marriage type relationship, you've been with someone for 30 years, there's still differences. There's always going to be. And so dialogue can happen between two people that really know each other or even live together,
Uh-huh.
because there's going to always be elements that we don't know about each other and mysteries to unravel and discover
Hmm.
about why we don't get along, or why we have conflicts that don't get resolved, or and so forth.
Yeah.
It becomes more obvious when we look at politics today, for
Yeah.
example. We've been doing dialogues recently in Utah between social workers who are more conservative and more liberal
Mhm.
voting, and discovering how easy it is even for us social workers to stereotype.
Yeah.
We're going to be sitting with Republicans or Democrats. Here's what they're like. The
Right.
mind
Right.
categorizes, especially the left hemispheric thinking, that they're like this, they believe in this, they do this, and then actually sitting with people like that with some dialogue ground rules, which we'll probably talk about, which are about civility, basically, because without civility there's no civilization, we
Mm.
believe. Then we start to discover how many of these assumptions we make, the left brain does, it's probably a survival mechanism from long ago,
Yeah.
are inaccurate and
Yeah.
unhelpful. Inaccurate and unhelpful. And
Interesting.
probably,
So any of these stereotypes or any of these biases or so forth, whether it be racism or sexism or xenophobia, anything like that, essentially, in many ways, you could say at its core is it's a perceptual. Is that fair to say that it is in the absence of dialogue? It's perceptual perceptions that result in the absence of giving and receiving influence, humanizing the other, humanizing confirm the absence of confirmation of otherness.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we start to see. I mean, when we say we love someone,
Yeah.
but we don't know them, is that love? You
Yeah.
know, and so dialogue involves both loving kindness as well as you know honesty,
Yeah.
really. Real sharing. And so we learn more about who each other is. We learn more about I always learn more about myself in dialogue. Because we're all mirrors for each other,
Yeah.
right?
That's great. That's great. So, what do you think is the relationship between dialogue and social work? Can you do social work without dialogue?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, you and I've talked about the origins of social work, and I don't know whether those early social workers used the term dialogue, but I think it's the same idea. And and so if I do if I work on any of the levels, so-called micro, meso, macro, I think the same idea applies. We're helping people, bridge the differences that divide us through relationship building,
Okay.
whether it's couple work, family work, even one-on-one. If it's just you and I and you're my social work shrink, like
Mhm.
like we're having a dialogue between the two of us. If I'm sitting with a couple, then they're in dialogue, and I'm facilitating or holding the space for them. Same thing with family work, group work, you know, and oftentimes, as we do social workers, we do group kinds of approaches, to help
Mhm.
folks community level too, like I'm doing dialogues, public dialogues each month these days
Mhm.
for the local community center, and the one at the library is open to everyone in the community. And, it's, it's a conversation and related, and we could talk about the different kinds of dialogues, but,
Yeah.
you know, but the purpose is still the same, and we're confirming each other's otherness. Like, I may disagree with you vehemently, but I confirm your right to have those opinions, and have those differences with me. And at the same time, I confirm mine with you. This is what I believe. I can bring that to you. Here's my perspective on it. And, with that kind of attitude, where we're being civil to each other and the purpose is trying to understand,
Yeah.
we can talk about anything.
It's really interesting because, this is Pro Social Workers as part of the Institute for Liberal Values. And recently, as I participated in some different experiences and podcasts with others in that venue, it's interesting how the dialogue, like you said, it helps me get to know myself. It helps me refine and understand and, maybe course correct a little bit. It really is refining. It's this core element of social work. I think you're right in that dialogue is inherent in social work. Social implies a relationship between two different entities. And so I would agree with you that all social work really is dialogue.
And we call it social work
Yeah.
because it can be fun. So it can
Yeah.
be social play, but
Right.
it's often difficult
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
scary,
Yeah.
but doable.
Yeah. It's not easy. It's not,
Not
it could be fun,
necessarily
but it's,
easy.
it's rarely easy. And when you're
Yeah,
dealing with ideological differences or differences of
that's right.
viewpoints. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So let me ask you, dialogue in and of itself, is it a means? Is it an end? Is it both? I mean, are we just talking? What's the difference between just kind of shooting the breeze and talking to be talking or talking to hear myself,
Okay,
speak?
that's a great question.
Yeah.
I think we risk getting into trouble if we call it an end. And that's because of our natural tendency to identify with what we do. So, if dialogue's an end, then I can get into what's the right dialogue approach, or, because that's probably, as this idea becomes more acceptable. I'm starting this program with Utah and ASW, where we're going to be doing trainings at schools in Utah, schools of social work on dialogue, right? And what typically happens in academia, then we start becoming territorial about the best dialogic approach,
Okay.
and so that becomes an end. So means, I think, more comfortable with that idea that it's that this basic idea of getting people together with ground rules, with which are shared values, and it involves some skill learning and knowledge as well, but basically that we're going to treat each other a certain way, as we uh, work on relationship. Without those, I think it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And the two most important ones are, remember the song RESPECT, Learn Now What It
Oh,
Means to
yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
So, when I speak respectfully to you. And we can spend a long time. We could do a whole podcast on that, right? Or
Sure.
two. What is respect? And the other one is listen for understanding. And you might say, well, I was, isn't that what people do? No. What do we do when the other person's talking, especially when there's conflict? Of course, we're thinking about our response,
Yeah. Reloading.
reloading. Yeah. So listening for understanding is pretty cool. And most of us want to be heard. And if I listen for understanding, there's this tendency to feel like I'm losing because we're all trained in debate. Practically every high school in the country has a debate team. We weren't able to find when I did my textbooks on dialogue, I couldn't find a single high school in the country that had a dialogue team. Dialogue. What's the difference? Debate has a winner and a loser. It's like war. You know, I win, you lose. Because I get points, and it's okay to what I would call misbehave to win. To go into attack mode to make my opponent look wrong or bad. In dialogue, it's a win-win outcome. We're all shooting for mutual understanding and loving relationship. Not love of what we think the other person is, but who they really are.
Yeah.
They're very, very different. As we all know. It's difficult to love other people because, in large part, they have the same qualities I do, and I don't always like them in me. So I can project them out on you and say, people drive me. Don't you hear all the time as a social worker, we hear people say, I hate people. And then, you want to say, well, aren't you a people?
Yeah.
I'm a people,
Yeah.
right? So usually when we say we hate people, what we're really saying, of course, also is that I don't really like myself very well, and all these qualities that, like we kind of hold in high esteem, the competitiveness, winning, losing, having wealth and power, and which we're in an era right now, aren't we, where we seem to be elevating that to a more importance. We want leaders who have lots of power and wealth and bravado, right? you know um uh that's always been in human nature. That's a potential in all of us, but is that is that is that
Yeah. A good point, because it gets things done quickly, and if you appeal to a particular authority and you want something, you're impatient.
yeah,
And I think dialogue is, you've got to be patient in dialogue.
it takes more work, doesn't it, Matt?
It really does.
Yeah, I mean, you could bring it down to the family level, and someone who's very patriarchal, let's say he's married to a woman, and things get done really quickly if he's the boss and she submits. But to have a dialogic marriage type relationship, it takes more work, you know, but the outcome is going to be different because there might actually be a relationship and not just a dictatorship.
Yeah. Yeah. In traditional patriarchy, that would be the case. If you have a definition of patriarchy that's more patient and nurturing and long suffering, and you know yeah, that's a different that's a certainly. Yeah, when there's a breakdown in any of these things, in any relationship, it's going. This is where I think I'm coming from. Is it a means or an end? It's kind of like saying, well, is the air we breathe, is
Oh,
that
I
a
see.
means or an end? Well, it's the oxygen that we
Yeah.
survive on, and so we need clean air. And dialogue kind of helps to filter the air,
Yeah.
giving one another grace and understanding.
Yeah. And that makes sense, Matt. I think you're right that, in that sense, it is an end. Also, that
Yeah.
we would hope that people are civil to each other, that listen for understanding, that speak with respect, that leaks out into their life.
Yeah. The social and emotional climate that we live in is very much important as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
Can you imagine, in the next presidential election, if we had really had dialogues instead of debates?
Yeah.
How different that would be, and how good that would be for our country
Yeah,
and
but
for the world. We're not there yet. We call them debate. I mean, dialogues. Sometimes we call these conversations dialogues,
yeah,
but they're really not, by the way we're defining it today.
right.
Obviously, they're attack mode, right? They're fierce debates,
Yeah,
you know,
very
and
much so.
yeah,
Very much so. So as we look at that, and it was interesting. I was I was online in 2020, the night before or maybe it was the day after one of the Biden Trump debates. and another social worker and I were talking back and forth a little bit about viewpoint diversity and on social work. And that was one of the responses from someone is, what would happen if the debates would take this dialogic tone rather than the debate?
Yeah.
And that was part of the genesis of the movement that we're trying to do within pro-social workers.
Yeah. What a great idea.
Yeah, just what you said, right on. And I think of this as well is that, if it's not an end, it's very close to an end. And I think you're right. We got to be careful about our own brand and insisting that it has to be my way of doing dialogue that's the best way, or getting into those kinds of things. But as I was thinking about that myself over the last, several months, if it's not an end, it certainly is almost existential. And, there's good, better, and best. But in the absence of dialogue, it could move from bad to worse to worse. If you don't think dialogue, if you don't think this interdependent relationship, pluralism is the way to go, think about, there are worse things than this, including, as you mentioned earlier, going to war, the absence of dialogue there. So let me ask you just a question. It was probably, between 5 and 10 years ago. I don't remember when, but there was, I can't remember if it was President Obama or President Biden that was in office, but there was criticism of engaging in talks with nations deemed as our foreign adversaries. And just this week, I heard that President Trump is eager to engage, or not eager, but willing to engage. Is there ever a time when we should not be engaging? Are there limits to dialogue? Or there are times when we should not be engaging in dialogue? And by bringing up both of those, I want to highlight that critics come from both directions there, depending on who's in office. But just saying more objectively, should we be engaging, or should the United States of America engage in dialogue with people seen as, or countries seen as our, as the adversary?
Well, I think we should especially engage in dialogue with countries we see as adversarial. Just like we should especially engage in dialogue locally with the groups or individuals who we feel mistreat us, or that there's hostility between them. I think here are some reasons not to have dialogue. One would be if it's not safe, and I don't mean psychological safety, because perhaps that's impossible,
Okay.
as many people say, but I mean physical. So, an example might be, you're working with a couple in couple counseling, and there's been a physical abuse going on, and probably psychological too. Then with it, there's a lot of evidence says, that's probably not a good idea, to get people into, their emotions with each other, if they're likely to go home and one person's going to harm the other. So, but that's like on that level, that's the micro level. Like on the macro level, I mean, I struggle with calling dialogue if a big country with a lot of power is having talks with a little country. So maybe that's the parallel. And they're really not interested in understanding the little country. They just want to get their way. So it's like, if you don't, we're engaging in little country over here, us big country, and we're going to do this to you and cut off money, or there'll be these punishments if you don't bend to our will. That's not dialogue. You can call it dialogue all you want.
But there's also kind of a confirmation of otherness, that it's your interests may be different than my interests, but there needs to be some degree of similarity. We got to acknowledge the power differentials.
Yeah, I would say that recognizing power differentials is essential, and recognizing not only that, but that, like Robin Williams says, I think it's in, I forget which film it was in now, darn it. Not Good Will Hunting. It was, Oh, What Dreams May Come. He says in a power struggle in relationships, if you win, you lose. And if you lose, you might win. What does that mean? If I win a power struggle with you, what are you going to feel? Typically resentment, and sooner or later, there'll be pushback. You may cower in fear of my power, but it's natural in humans to be resentful about being bullied, right? So it's not enlightened to bully. I don't think. And then you might say, well, how would you ever get anything done if you got to talk to everybody in the world? Can't just the big countries be bossy? And I think we have to say we've got to move out of that age. Some people call it the era of the patriarchy. We have to move out of that era of the patriarchy where patriarchy could be defined as a monologue. Buber maybe said it best that he said that when there's violence, it changes from dialogue to monologue.
Yeah.
It's no longer a dialogue, right?
Absolutely.
Because it silences the other. Violence silences the other. And verbal violence is just as violent as physical. If I say, yeah, we're going to engage in talks with this little country, and if they don't do what we say, we're going to do this and do that. That's monologue.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
All right.
And I know a lot of people who disagree with me and say I'm naive. Maybe I am. But I think that approaching things in a dialogic level on the macro level is more enlightened for the well-being of everyone.
Gotcha. So safety and shared interests, or that there's got to be there's an acknowledgement of differences, but we've got to have some type of common ground. You got to start from a position of common ground, even if you have a much different position in getting there, or even what the ground should look like. It's finding some commonality, and maybe common ground isn't the right way to describe it, but there's got to be some type of something that's bringing you together.
Well, I think you're right that I like what you're saying, Matt. And I think that, the way it looks to me is, there's different phases of dialogic work we could teach students, in social work. And the first phase is one of the most difficult, which is setting up the dialogue, is one way to call it. And that's like, people don't know what a dialogue is.
Yeah. Can we go into that? Can we move to the next slide and talk a little bit about how dialogue looks?
Yeah. Well, this slide and the next show the do's and don'ts of the dialogue ground rules. And these have been developed over years. And we find that groups, no matter if they are 70-year-old retired people or 20-year-olds or teenagers, come up with similar rules. These are, I'm not saying it's finished, it's an evolving document, but and like I mentioned, listen for understanding and speak respectfully are important. Speaking for myself just simply means that I don't say I can't speak for all men, even if I identify as a male. For amnesty means people are going to make mistakes, so we don't necessarily have to kick them out, because dialogue is a new set of skills, knowledge, and values. We give people a break for being human. And waiting a while before you speak again is really important. If the facilitator allows, someone to take over a conversation, or certainly to be violent in a conversation, verbally or physically, then I'm participating in that. And so we have to set, and then owning my biases, judgments, and projections, I think is really important, and it seldom done in our world. Most of the time, people reveal their biases, judgments, and projections verbally only under duress when there's a fight. And, and we finally will say it and the words come out rough, as the song goes. It's not said with kindness, with the intent of loving kindness. So in dialogue, I can actually say, I have a bias about people that look like you, talk like you, believe like you, and here's the things I believe. But if the intent is for understanding, that creates relationship rather than pushes us further away. And I've seen it work.
Yeah.
Even with the most difficult topics like racism and sexism, seen people talk about their stereotypes about the other group in what we call intergroup dialogue, where you got people that maybe identify with a certain race or not, or a certain religion, or a certain sexual orientation or whatever, and the other folks are different. And
you
they
have
can
some examples of that where you've seen it, whether it's macro, micro, or meso, where share a success story or two.
Well, like when I was invited to do trainings on dialogue, and related to race, which I think is probably, it might be the hardest topic for people to talk about today in the U.S. Often where I set it up is just, and we'd have people of different races in these groups, which changes the whole dynamic. If you have all like white folks or all, people who identifies African American, for example, the conversation is going to sound different, right? But as soon as there's people of a different race in the room, then there's, we have all sorts of reactions to that. So one way to deal with that would be to ask people to sit together, one in dyads or little small groups, depending on the size of the big group, and talk about their stereotypes about the other. And, and once they get, at first people are kind of giggle uncomfortably and kind of, really? You're going to ask us to do that? What? And then the dialogue ground rules are posted in the front. We talk about them again. And it's important to explain, well, why are we doing this? Not just to be, to do something uncomfortable for the heck of it. We're doing this because you can't, otherwise it'll never heal. Healing means to be healed means to become whole. And it comes from the Latin word for wholeness, and so, well, how does that apply? Well, rarely do we own our stereotypes. And say, so often I would say as a facilitator, because you don't want to ask people to do things you're not willing to do. I'll say at the beginning of this, I am racist. So what do you mean by that? I'll talk about stuff I heard when I was a kid and how that's in me. And what I mean by I'm racist is those are still in me. And, and consciousness of those things is what keeps them at bay. To be aware of, all the stuff that came out of the mouth of my grandfather, about people of color that I heard when I was a kid, for example, because we lived on the south side of Chicago. I heard a lot of hate.
So you're willing
and fear.
You're almost willing to sacrifice. I mean, being called a racist is one of the worst things that you can call anyone nowadays. But for the sake of the relationship, you are willing to say, I'm racist, and then define what that means. I'm racist because I have heard and I have memories of racist ideas, thoughts.
Right. Well, it's the truth. And truth telling can lead to a relationship, if it's done with loving kindness. The intent.
Say a little bit more about them, because that's where I wonder if we would, where there might be some kind of pushback or challenging that requiring people to say that they're racist. That is pretty controversial.
I don't require them to say anything. I'm just modeling me.
Right. Okay.
And the word discipline has disciple in it. Yeah. Disciple means follower.
Yeah.
So I'm just modeling a certain way of being. If they're not ready to do it yet,
yeah,
that's fine. But I shouldn't. I believe that I shouldn't expect them to even consider this if I'm not doing it. So I'm just saying, here's the conversation we're going to have. This is the setup. This is what we're going to try to do. And this is why. And then like in social work, we always say, take people where they're at.
Yeah.
So what layer, so for some people, just sitting in the room and breathing is a success.
Yeah.
I sat with people of this other, and I'll say that I'm so proud of you that you said, maybe you'll get there if you want to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And for others, they're willing to do it. And sometimes people will get defensive and angry and blah, blah, blah. And then you deal with that. It's working if there's discomfort.
Yeah.
Something's happening in the room. And, so dialogue facilitation is probably requires some training and preparation, like, self-reflection.
You bet.
Like I couldn't stand up in front of everybody and say that with integrity if I hadn't looked at myself and seen it. And it's a mistake to go to either extreme. It's a mistake to say to say in front of everyone I'm racist and then say, and I'm a terrible person.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
One extreme, and the other extreme would be, I'm racist. So what? In the
context of owning just your own past experiences, it's not necessarily having to take a one down position or it's being authentic. It's being genuine. It's not saying those things just okay.
I have my teachers just like we all do. And one is a good friend of mine who is African-American woman. We used to co-facilitate a dialogue group on campus for years called Dialogue Training Group, which is only about race. And we always had about half white and half people of color in there, and she said, how could people feel good about slavery? And the reason we rarely own our biases and our racism is because we're ashamed of it. And so I have to say this because I think it comes up so often, frequently at the end of a conversation about race, and often around other subjects like sexism, the isms around who you're attracted to, and many other topics as well. People at the end towards the end of the meeting, someone will say in the back of the room, well, you just want to make us feel bad about ourselves. You just want to criticize, make me feel bad, about who I am. And what I learned to say, because I realized, so I think about what was going on, is I say something like, if I thought shame would help, I might try to shame you, but it doesn't help. And you came in with that shame
Yeah.
about, how you feel about the other. Don't lay that on me. I didn't create that.
Yeah.
If shame worked, we wouldn't have racism because almost all people have shame about
Right.
it. Right? Like my
Exactly.
friend Deborah said, how can you feel good about slavery?
Right.
I mean, if you're sensitive, all like they look different, but how would you like it if your family were slaves?
Yeah.
Turn it around.
Yeah. Exactly.
Children know that, so adults certainly know it. So I think it's just saying what's true. It can be very effective, not with everybody, not in every situation, to just start out right away being honest.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good point. I think there are some really honesty and just transparency, entering with some degree of trust, not complete trust. You don't go in and start declaring your love for someone until you know them, and you're not going to know them until you've heard and understood them. So I think we have to be genuine and authentic, not to try and get to the end too quickly, but recognize some movement. About 10 years ago, I was living in Arizona, and I heard on the radio about this. You remember when we used to listen to the radio?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I was listening to the radio back then, and heard about this Utah compromise, where the Utah legislature, very conservative, ultimately passed a bill preserving and protecting the rights of the LGBTQ population. And um, and I thought, wow, I'm interested in that. Let's talk a little bit about that. And that subsequently provided a little bit of groundwork. It took multiple attempts in Congress to pass the Respect for Marriage Act that preserves those same rights on a federal level while also preserving religious liberty and finding some common ground. I think that is just an example of, when you're talking about dialogue, that's what came to my mind, is finding ways on a macro level, as well as marital work, relationship work, doing some training. That kind of speaks as some examples of how that might work. Were you part of that? Were you involved in that? I wasn't here then.
I was aware of it, but I wasn't, lobbying.
Gotcha. I know everybody wasn't happy that they didn't get everything that they wanted. I've heard some comments from folks, but progress is progress, a little bit at a time. What about when dialogue breaks down? What does that look like? How do we deal with it when dialogue breaks down?
Look at the next slide.
Okay.
So here's things that can break down dialogue. Interrupting. A lot of us do that, and we're not even aware of it. And often it's because of the privileges that we have, or think we should have, right? Making negative gestures. Like if you see something and I go, or roll my eyes. It can cause as much injury as if I said that was stupid. Making others wrong. So I can disagree with you without making you wrong. And sometimes we have to spend some time on that, because I think there's still a lot of confusion in our country between, the two opposites of, I'll use the pencil as a symbol. So, bullying and being a wimp, if you want to use those terms, they're opposites. And we call this aggressive and this is passive, right? And we might say that assertive is in the middle. So bullies put others down to put themselves up. Wimps put themselves down, we say, to put others up, and assertive is putting myself up without putting you down. So everyone wins. That's a simple idea, but there's confusion about that every day. And how many times have you seen someone, an adult in public, display anger in an assertive, healthy way? It's very rare. Most of us tend to be passive aggressive, and we pout and withdraw, when we're angry or hurt, and a few of us are aggressive. The best known are the mass murderers, that just kill anyone. The two opposites, right? Rare is the person that can speak especially in a public arena, a public space, and just be assertive. This is something I feel really strongly about without making other people wrong. So, like if I said, something that you disagree with, you could say, well, Dr. Dave, you're an idiot, right? And, that of course that's making me wrong, but, you could say also, hey, I kind of get why you're there from when you told me your story, and I can appreciate that. I have a different perspective. I'd love to tell you my story. Very powerful way to disagree without disengaging, and there's an invitation, and people love to tell their stories. In fact, I just did a class this morning where I asked people, it was on the climate crisis, and we were talking about, what are some things we can do about it? And asking people to tell their story about earth, air, fire, and water, the four elements in many wisdom traditions, is a way to invite people to just, find, like you said, a common ground. I don't know that common ground is always there before a dialogue, unless the common ground is an interest in at least trying a dialogue,
Okay. So it's kind of
but
co-discovered. It's mutually discovered.
it may be
It's
mutually
not
discovered.
obvious.
Yeah. But like what I was talking about a little bit before, Matt, just setting up a dialogue is hard because people aren't used to it. They don't have an experience with it. The word has been misused, so I think you have to talk about these things a little bit and say, we want to get together and have a conversation. What they imagine is somebody talking at them, and what they haven't experienced yet is what we're talking about, like people being as passionate as they are and not pretending they aren't, but in a civil way. What is that? How could you do that? Well, come and we'll see if we can find out. Let's try it.
Well, that's wonderful. So these ground rules, I think this is kind of the how, in a very basic, straightforward way. You can use these things. I mean, I could see applications of each of these in clinical work, in meso work, and in our macro work as well.
Yeah, we at the Center for Teaching and Learning at the U, we offered these to new teachers in the new teacher workshops. When first year they come, and they can put it in their syllabus or even hang it on the wall.
Yeah, it's a good point. Tell me a little bit just about, is there anything specific in terms of clinical practice, if we were to recommend tools or resources to help somebody develop strong dialogic skills training for their clinical work? Any suggestions there?
Sure. I think the best way to learn the skills, knowledge, and values involved in dialogue is to engage in a dialogue. And so, I think a training program, I mean, I was able to do it. I had the privilege of being the Peace and Conflict Studies director for a while. And so we had a class called Dialogue Models. And what we did was had the students' main assignments were all around being engaged in dialogue. And then later in the semester, they would try facilitating with real people they invited into the classroom who belonged to groups that they really didn't like. That was their assignment. And when you're in a dialogue, then just, practicing it so you understand what it feels like, because it's not super comfortable for most of us, to do that. And then, being willing to get feedback, because my co-teacher in that is a really good friend of mine, David Parker. He and I would give feedback to people about, like, because you get activated. as a facilitator, right? And just like anybody else, it's not like you're immune, to the, and then it's important to have it. So there's an internal dialogue that has to happen too. And learning, like, isn't that interesting? I'm really pissed off at that person over there. Why is that? Why does that, what they said, oh, what's that? I can see now why that's my stuff around that, and the more you do it, you can do that while you're actually facilitating.
That's
You can
right.
notice that, and sometimes you can even own it. You might even say sometimes, if you think it would be helpful, I noticed I had a reaction to that, and that's some of my own stuff. Like,
That's
just like as a
right.
therapist. Yeah. I think everyone could take a dialogue class as part of their first year MSW program or something.
Yeah.
Maybe even the BSW, like why not? Because we use those things all the time. Why not make it explicit, right? And have that class be real, not just intellectual. They could have slides like these, but have them invite into the classroom people who are different, in some way, and have those tough conversations.
That's great. We had a dialogue experience. I attended two of the sessions that you did. I thought they were sequential. I didn't realize that they were kind of similar experiences. So I attended two of them. But in one of them, one of the participants shared their experience after the election of President Trump. Looking at Trump, at President Trump, there's a lot there that avails itself to criticism and critique and so forth. And the impact that had on the individual was obvious, and it was painful, and it was certainly something that I could feel. At the same time, he also said, "Is this what you voted for?" And when I highlighted that, I think we can separate voting for President Trump from all of the other things that went on. And when I responded, it didn't seem to land very well. Do you remember that at all? Do you
Was
remember
this
that
a
interaction?
person? I do. I can't remember the detail. Did they actually happen to have voted for Trump? Did they talk about
No,
that?
he didn't vote for Trump.
Okay. All
He
right.
had a neighbor that
Understood. Yeah.
it changed drastically since
Yeah.
the Trump election. I believe that was my
Yeah.
recollection.
Yeah. I remember that too.
Yeah, and I don't know if you remember the details of that. It was probably more me because it was more personal to me. But I thought, man, that didn't land very well. That didn't, I'm trying to highlight that, hey, you can vote for President Trump without agreeing with his demeanor and his, it could be that you were voting against some other things that you saw. Maybe it wasn't a vote for, good, better, and best, but bad, worse, and worse. And I just remember thinking, I wonder how I could have handled that differently. I
Yeah.
don't know if you
That's a great.
remember that at all.
Yeah. No, I think so, and I think you're right. It could have been handled differently.
How could
Yeah.
any thoughts on what I, was that,
Yeah.
you always have to start from a position of, all
Yeah.
right, is it I? Is there something that I, may have missed there? Or could I, any suggestions you'd have for me as you give me feedback on that interaction?
As I understand what you're talking about, it seems to me we could use the language of saying that this is about the ego in someone that would make a statement like that.
Mm.
Isn't that what you voted for? Like if I said that to a group of people who supported Trump,
Mhm.
you know, and that wouldn't land well with them. And tell me if I'm following you right,
Yeah, that's
because
exactly it.
okay,
You're
it
trying to
wouldn't
give
land well with,
voice to that.
yeah,
No, that of course they didn't vote for that.
yeah, yeah, right. If I identify with something, particularly a belief, as Eckhart Tolle
Mhm.
says, egoic, that's an egoic function of my thinking
Yeah,
mind, especially left hemispheric. So that's what the human ego, we could say, ego is used in a lot of different ways by different
yeah,
writers, but I'm kind of using it in the way that Tolle writes about it, and others more in the last 30 years. Ego is that which identifies. Then it goes beyond just I voted Democrat or Republican. I voted for Kamala Harris or,
yeah.
Donald Trump. It's like I am identified with Trump. He is I am him. So if you say
Uh-huh.
anything about him,
Yeah.
then it's an attack on me.
Oh, okay.
And
Over
I can
identification, losing your own identity. Yeah.
more like it's possible, right? It's possible for you and I to vote differently, but
Uh-huh.
not identify with
Yes.
the party that they belong
Exactly.
to. Yeah. And so, and if I don't identify because I'm aware of the ego and I don't want to do that, then I'm less likely to react with defensiveness or anger. If
Gotcha.
you say, I look at that differently, or that's what you voted for, Dave.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
you idiot, right?
Yeah.
Then there's a feeling of personal attack. So
Yeah.
I think, teaching about the ego, this idea, call it what you want. I don't know, that's the word we seem to be using now in the literature. I think it's really helpful to
Is
dialogue
it similar to
facilitation.
identity?
Yes, it is identity. I mean, that's what Tolle says. It very
Okay.
simply, he defines the ego is that which identifies
Yeah.
with anything, particularly beliefs.
Right. Right.
But it also can identify like I'm an American,
Yeah.
meaning usually if you say that in the US, you're talking about the US,
Uh-huh.
and if it's fine to love your country.
Gotcha.
I've considered it a privilege to live in the US, and I
Okay.
do have love for my country. But if I
Good.
identify
Yeah.
it as that's who I am,
Is your primary
then
identity.
then if you say anything about the US, that's an attack on me. I can love my country, I can love my wife, I can love uh, the principles of a particular party. I can believe in a certain approach to therapy
Right.
without identifying with it. And why do we identify? We can get into all that, but
Interesting.
yeah, if that does
Hey,
that make
some
sense?
point conversation, right? A little bit of the relationship between identity and and dialogue, um, and how
Well, I
to.
think so
Yeah.
because usually it's ego that gets offended.
Yeah.
And the research is fascinating. Just recently, that it's been in the literature that scientists have discovered that when you have outrage, it's like a high.
Yeah.
There's chemicals that are released in the brain that are similar to like if you're using mind altering street drugs.
Right.
And so we're really in an outrage epidemic, don't you think? Everybody's outraged.
Yeah.
Mishra's book on the age of
Yeah.
anger, everyone's angry about
Yeah.
something, and
Absolutely.
noticing that that's what's probably happening.
Gotcha.
Like I get a kick out of being outraged and I can feel my moral superiority. It's ego too, because I'm right. I'm moral superior. Whenever I compare myself to others, that's also ego.
Gotcha.
I'm
Very
superior
good.
to you, right?
Yeah. Social referencing.
Like a friend of mine says, who's a psychiatrist, he says you can't help people therapeutically till you first deal with their grandiosity. Because we all got some, and
Yeah.
that's ego,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And doesn't everyone seem to have a sense of moral superiority today?
Not
You
me.
know, except, yeah, yeah. Those, I mean, besides you and I, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Exactly.
good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Dave, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you
This
for
has been
asking me to do
yeah,
this.
this has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed our approach and the dialogue that we've had. So
Thanks
thank
for the
you
great
for
questions.
good. Yeah. This is part of the pro social workers movement, and we make this content available. Currently, it's available for free. People only pay for their CEUs, and so we want to make it available to anyone. And so maybe we'll have some future conversations about dialogue practice and how they can use that. But we like to punctuate each of our podcasts, our discussions with giving you an opportunity to describe what does it mean to be pro-social. David Darrison, what does pro-social mean to you?
I used to be hung up on being selfish when I was in an undergrad, and I had a mentor that said to me, shut up. You can't do anything that isn't selfish. By nature, everything we do is selfish. So be selfish in a way that doesn't cause harm and maybe
Mhm.
does good. And I think pro-social is the ultimate selfish act because ultimately it's our best chance to feel good. The best way to deal, like I have social work friends and students in college, who say, I don't know how to deal with what's going on in the country right now. And I'm really deeply
Uh,
bummed, and I'll say, well, the quickest way out of that is to try to help someone else that's deeply bummed,
yeah,
So something about, I think to me, pro-social is about recognizing how good it is for me to go from I to we. And so I'm no saint if I'm being pro-social. I'm being very selfish because it's good for my soul.
It's a little bit of interdependence.
It's in the enlightened self-interest to be concerned about the rest of humanity.
That's right.
Because otherwise, we're not going to make it. We won't even survive, right? Is what I think. So what do you think about that?
That's great. That's great. Yeah. Being selfish without causing harm. That's
enlightened selfishness.
Enlightened selfishness. That's great. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate this, and I look forward to our continued conversations.
Thanks, Matt.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the ProSocial Workers Podcast. We're grateful to our guests for sharing their insights, and to you, our listeners, for being part of this journey. If you'd like to earn continuing education credits, don't forget to visit our website at prosocialworkers.com, where you can register, pay a fee, complete a course evaluation, and take a quick quiz. We look forward to having you with us next time as we continue to explore how we can put the social back into social work.